Before I jump in, I just want to give a little bit of a background on you before we start with the questions. So Debbie is an expert, consultant, she's a best-selling author, and she's a public speaker. She focuses on workplaces, women, and law. For 20 years, she's been covered by hundreds of news outlets. They've featured her work, including the New York Times, NBC Nightly News, NPR, The Wall Street Journal, and American Reporter. So I'm so glad she could join us and add Miss JD to that list. She's written 2 ABA best-selling books, Law and Reorder and Finding Bliss, and she co-authored that last one. Her international work includes multiple engagements in The Hague as well as in Paris at the French Senate, in London and Vienna, and other places abroad. She runs the DEH Speaker Series that hosts programming in New York City and by webcast, generally attracting more than 1,000 participants per quarter. She's also a co-founder of Bliss Lawyers, which is a company that employs high-caliber attorneys who work on temporary engagements for law firms and in-house legal departments across the U.S. So everybody join me in welcoming Debbie. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Katie, and it's just a pleasure to collaborate with you today and, again, collaborate with Ms. JD. I've been working intermittently with Ms. JD for probably, 5-10 years, and I'm such a fan of this organization and just think the work you guys are doing is wonderful. So delighted to have this opportunity again.
So I'm going to jump right in with some questions. We have quite a few that we're going to try to cover today. And I'd like to start by talking about, advocating for yourself in your workplace. What are some ways that everyone on the call can kind of ensure that their boss and supervisors know the value that they're adding in the workplace?
So it's interesting. I think that when you talk about advocating for yourself, of course, people immediately go inward and think about themselves. And I actually recommend the opposite. I recommend as a starting place to actually understand your audience, because you're not going to be effective as an advocate. And let me just pause. I know you mentioned this, Katie, but if everybody could just remember to mute their line, that would be great. Okay. Hopefully people will do that and continue to mute your lines as you join. So anyway, when in advocating for yourself, rather than focus inwardly on how great you are and how you want to convey that, I actually think the first step is knowing and understanding your audience. So that may be your boss. It may be the management team at large at your company or your firm, or maybe you're a law student and it's having your professors understand who you are. But the way you're going to be able to do that effectively is actually getting to know them, getting to know what their needs are, what their challenges are, what their interests are. Scheduling one-on-ones with them to try to understand what they're really trying to achieve and how your efforts can support that, and being really deliberate about getting to know them, not just on a professional level, but getting to know all of their idiosyncratic needs so that you can show that you are being really responsive and attentive to them. Only once you understand your audience are you going to be more effective at actually then demonstrating your value to them and really be able to tailor your message to them, which is really how you show your value. Is that once you understand what is a priority for your colleagues, your boss, again, your professors, whomever it may be, then you're going to be able to tailor your message and show how you can actually deliver value.
And when women are starting to speak up and tailoring that to show their value, what are some roadblocks that you find women face to being their own advocate?
Sure, and I've had the benefit through you, of course, of seeing the participants on today's call, and of the couple hundred people participating, we have a wonderful presence for women, but we also have men on the line. And what I want to say is my remarks today will be applicable to both women and men. The issues that we'll talk about in particular in relation to this question I see as being more acute for women, but actually the challenges really are gender neutral in that respect. I think something that is a starting point, and again I see this more acutely for women, is simply the notion of taking credit where credit is due. There's this fear of self-promotion and being that obnoxious self-promoter, and we've all encountered that person at work or through our family and friends, and we don't want to be those people. But I often see women even falling short of taking credit where credit is due. So there's anxiety about taking credit because of this fear of being known as a self-promoter, and also just an assumption that our accomplishments should speak for ourselves. But in reality, in today's competitive marketplace, it's not enough to just be good. It's important to be able to demonstrate your value as a team member, but also claim your contribution. It's a really fine line, and I think the roadblocks to your question are that people are worried that they're going to think you're just thinking about yourself. You're not a team player. Your accomplishments should speak for themselves. You're, a bragger. You are not going to be liked. All of those anxieties, or maybe, by the way, that you don't even justify or deserve the claim of credit that you're trying to get. So those insecurities really stand in a lot of people's way. And again, something I see more sort of a heightened concern among women is even when they do get up the nerve to self-promote, and again, do it in such a delicate way that they're still showing they're a team player, even when they do that, they're judged more harshly for it. So even if they overcome the first hurdle, they're still facing the second one, and the research supports that. So those roadblocks are very real. That said, it's really important to be able to demonstrate your contribution and do it in such a way that people understand the value you're delivering.
And when we come kind of full circle, people are advocating for themselves and talking about their accomplishments. You want to be doing that regularly, but we do get to a time, and maybe it is time to ask for a raise or a promotion or kind of the big ask. What are some tips you have for people when they're starting to formulate that ask and starting to think about wanting those things and wanting to speak to a supervisor about those?
Sure. I think that there is a time that you get to where you want that promotion or that increased comp, whatever that ask may be. And again, I think the first step is to be thoughtful about how the audience is going to receive that information. So rather than, again, think inwardly at that point, instead think outwardly and think, is this a good time to make this ask? So if you're at a company and they just had a round of layoffs, this isn't the time to talk about increased pay or increased promotion. So having that level of awareness of what the receptivity is of the environment is a threshold issue, because even if you are super talented and you deserve that promotion, you deserve that increased comp, if the environment in which you're working is not able to support that transition at this time, then you're going to seem really just really out of it to be able to make that ask, and it's going to really fall on your feet. It could really sort of come back to bite you. So having that awareness of whether the timing is right within your organization is the threshold issue. And then the next step is really, if you think you are deserving of that promotion or that increased comp, the details about how you make that ask really matter. I think people often are so focused on the content and their justification for why they deserve that promotion or increased comp, but actually half of how you're evaluated is your delivery. So it's not, again, just what your ask is, but it's how you're going to ask. So if it's a sensitive issue or something really important to you, make the ask in person if you can. If it's not feasible, that's one thing, but think, I'm going to make this ask in person so that I can make eye contact with that person and show that I exude the confidence and really are, this is something very important and deliberate to me to make it happen. Beyond those details, and again, knowing that the timing is right for your organization, another piece of it is making it easy for your boss or supervisor to say yes. And what I mean by that is build the case for them, because inevitably, if you're proposing to your boss, for example, for increased comp, that boss of yours likely will have another boss. And so you need to make it as easy as possible to show why it's in the company or firm or organization's interest to promote you. And you've got to have anticipated what the pushback will be. Oh, maybe this person hasn't been here long enough. Well, why is it still important to do that? Or, importantly, how can you help the company or firm more by being in that increased role? You'll hear this over and over from me, but one real priority I make whenever I advise on self-promotion is to think, when can you align your own self-promotion with that of your employer's? Anytime you can do that, you're going to have a much greater success rate. So again, in terms of, let's say, a title, let's say you're a law firm lawyer and you are counsel and you're trying to become a partner, one of your arguments is, I will have better success with business development, and that will better the firm if I have the partner title. Going out there without the partner title is impeding my success. So really aligning your own interests with that of your employer is one of the most successful self-promotion techniques that I've seen out there, and I can provide other examples of that as well. The other 2 points I want to make on this, which I think are also important, one is the importance to show gratitude. So maybe you are making that ask of your boss, but it will then depend on your boss making that pitch to somebody else. Show gratitude. A lot of times there's this sort of entitlement that people may presume, like, I deserve this. Why do I have to say thank you? But you know what? If anybody is going to bat for you, you say thank you. So that's a critical piece. And then the other piece is persistence. You want to balance persistence with being respectful of somebody's judgment call, but you also want to be able to say, if the answer is no, would there be a good time that this decision is reconsidered? Or are there others who I can follow up with who may be a resource on this and can give me more feedback about why the decision is no at this time? And then you mark your calendar for that follow-up, or you have those additional conversations with whomever may be the designated point people. But really, when you have the conversation, make sure that you approach it in a sort of non-defensive way, but also to show a respectful persistence to really try to get an understanding, if the answer is no, really why it's no.
Those are great tips. I really think that pretty much probably everybody on the call can take a couple of things from all of those. So I want to talk a little bit, too, about when you are starting at a new job and you want to be advocating for maybe a higher salary than they've offered you, but it's kind of, a lot of people are concerned with finding that balance of, you just got an offer, you don't want to come in and seem, pushy, those kind of things. What are some ways to kind of adapt that advice you provided when maybe you don't have a previous relationship with the supervisor or the person you're making the ask of?
Right, and that's a hard thing to do, is to make an ask, really, which is, in a new job, or you've got that offer in hand, let's say, because it's harder to know your audience. And as I advised before, knowing your audience is a big piece of being successful in the result, because you can tailor your advice accordingly, or your request accordingly. So just as a starting place, make sure the offer is in hand first. I think that people forget that they really are in a sell mode until they get that offer. And so there'll be plenty of time after the offer is given to then start asking the hard questions, but make sure that they really want you, and then at that point you can start being more deliberate about the questions that you ask that are important to you. Again, it's really helpful to gather intelligence. The more information you have going into an ask, the more empowered you are by your information. So maybe you've been at a law firm and you're going in-house, and you want to know, well, what is the industry, in the tech industry, let's say, what is the expectation of somebody going in, let's say, at Associate General Counsel? Sort of what's typical in this geography, in this industry. So all of that market intelligence will better inform what is an appropriate ask, because you really don't want to be out of bounds on that, and you want to have done your research about, again, industry, geography, and you can collect that information from peers and online and do your research about that. But you want to think when you are ready to make that ask of how that ask that you're going to make is going to benefit your prospective employer. How would that positively reflect on your employer in the future? So again, if you're a law firm lawyer and then you're negotiating to go into a new law firm, that title is going to help potentially with your business development prospects and in turn benefit your firm. So as you're a new candidate a new employee at a new company or firm, you want to think again, how do I better align the ask that I have with my success? Or maybe you're going in and you're going to be leading a team in an in-house legal department, and there's a debate over whether you get, a different title, whether it's deputy GC versus associate GC. And if you get the deputy GC title, maybe that's going to help you manage that team more, just because maybe you'll have the deference of the team, or it's more clear what the hierarchy is and what the reporting structure is. So again, thinking about what your ask is, how will that better your future employer? That's all going to help in terms of your asks. But again, you want to make sure you've done your homework, that your asks are not out of bounds. And I think the analogy is this isn't a real estate transaction where, let's say, you're purchasing an apartment from somebody and you'll never see that person, or maybe there's a broker in between. You'll always be polite because that's the right thing to do, but that's a one-time transaction where you're not going to be interacting with that person. In contrast, with a new prospective employer, assuming the negotiation goes well, this is going to be your new home. You want to be really careful because all of those questions and how you ask those questions are partly how that employer is going to view you. And even though some of us, and again, interesting research on this around women, is that sometimes we are not as deliberate in negotiating on our own behalf, but then we are much more effective on, let's say, negotiating on behalf of a client. People don't always make that assumption. They think, well, the way she's representing herself, I don't know if she would represent the company in the way we want. And so people draw those analogies. You have to be very thoughtful in making in those negotiated asks with a new employer, because they are judging you for the long term and thinking that you'll be with them.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, advocating for ourselves versus advocating for other people. And I think it's really important for really anyone in any profession to have some people who are advocating on their behalf, who are in their corner and can help push them forward. So how do you recommend people find these kind of mentors or sponsors that are really going to help them push forward? And, how many of those people should you have?
Absolutely. It's interesting, this issue, and you use the terms mentor and sponsor. These are terms of art that some people use interchangeably, and they're actually really interesting defined terms that mean different things. So let me start with just parsing out what those terms really mean, and then go into your question about really how to develop those relationships. So a mentor is somebody who may be somebody powerful, but maybe not. And historically, mentors are somebody who will show you the way, and if you're starting in a new law firm, for example, many firms have mentoring programs. They'll do an artificial pairing of pairing this first-year associate with a senior-level associate, let's say, or a partner. So they are relationships that can be surrounded by people of influence, but not necessarily. And what's interesting is the research around mentorship showed that there's not necessarily a causal relationship between strong mentoring relationships and increased promotion, increased comp, increased trajectory of success professionally, which is how the research started really developing around sponsorship. And people use the term sponsor or champion interchangeably. And originally, Sylviane Hewlett did some interesting research that came out of the Harvard Business Review that said a sponsor is different from a mentor in that a sponsor is somebody, by definition, who's a power broker. But not just a power broker, somebody who's willing to use his or her power to back somebody who's high potential. And that's the other difference with sponsorship, is it's not only somebody of influence who's willing to use his or her power, but also that sponsor's only going to back somebody who's high potential, because if he or she has a lot of power, they only want to put their name behind somebody who's really worthy. So that's just as a starting place. Is sponsorship is really very different from mentorship. And interestingly, the research has shown that if you have a strong sponsorship relationship, it does have that causal relationship between increased comp, increased promotion, et cetera. The other thing of note is that women and people of color don't organically develop those relationships at the same rates. And the research supports that more often there are more white men in power, and they naturally will gravitate to others who look like them. And so those organic relationships are happening very naturally. That doesn't mean there's anything nefarious going on. It's just that we all have the tendency to gravitate to the people who look like us. The reason why I raise that is it's that much more important for women and people of color to make sure they're not slipping through the cracks and that they have the opportunities to access those relationships. So to your point, how do you develop those relationships? I think as a junior person or somebody who's a potential sponsee who's looking for a sponsor, the starting point is being indispensable. You really need to be good. To get those people to back you, you have to be indispensable to them, not only in delivering top-notch work, but also being responsive and accessible. And if you're able to do that, it makes all the difference. There's a quote by Carla Harris, who is the Vice Chair of Investment Management at Morgan Stanley, and her quote is, "All the important decisions about your career take place when you're not in the room." And the idea is that how do you get somebody to talk about you when you're not in the room? I think some women make the mistake of thinking they're only going to seek out senior women to sponsor them, and I think that is a mistake. And the research shows that it actually has no gender impact. So whether you have a male or female sponsor doesn't matter, as long as the sponsor is somebody who is a power broker who's willing to use his or her power. And the reality is there are more men out there who are still holding those roles. And so if women narrow their options to only seek out sponsors who are female, it's a disproportionate burden on those women power brokers, but also there's just not enough to go around. So that is not advisable. Just one other thing I wanted to mention, another term that people often use when we're talking about mentoring or sponsorship is role models. And role models are also different from sponsors. Role models are often people who you admire. Maybe, when I was a young associate at a firm, I looked at the senior women partners. I had 2 kids and then 3 kids at the time, and I thought, who can I mirror myself after? Is this a place I could see myself one day? So role models, again, are different from sponsors or mentors, and it's important to make that distinction. But really, again, coming back to your question, the sponsorship relationships, which are the ones that are really going to make a difference in your career, what's most important is that they're symbiotic, that you need that person as much as they need you. And I think what's hard for somebody who's more junior to appreciate is how could they give that same value? How can they be indispensable to that? And I just want to give one example to me that's really a powerful one that shows how a sponsee is just as important to the relationship as the sponsor. Years ago, I did an event with Julie Sweet when she was general counsel of Accenture, and she told a story about how when she was a junior associate at a top law firm in New York, there was a senior partner who was doing really interesting work, who was really impressive, and she really wanted to learn from this senior partner. But he was, so busy. How was she going to access him? And so one day she got up the nerve to go into his office and said, I know you're doing this amazing work. I know you've got so much going on, but I'm really interested in your practice area and learning from you. I'll do anything, any of the work on your desk that you don't want to do. I'll write that first draft of that article you've been offered to write that you don't have time, or draft that brief, or whatever it is that you don't want to do. Well, she was an absolute star. So what senior partner firm doesn't want some star to say, I'll make you look good. I'll do all the work. I'll save you all the time. So that was just a great example in my mind when she told that story of, well, she needed him and he became instrumental in her career. But if you're a power broker, you need those people because you can't do all that work. And so you need those people just as much as they need you.
I think that's a great story, and I think, how cool is that for her to be able to go in and take advantage of a relationship like that. And I think it's really important that we're all taking a look around and seeing who is in our circle that could fill that role and that we could be indispensable for as well.
Right.
And I know we have quite a few new attorneys, maybe some law students on the call. So when you're starting out and you're working on kind of building up that network and maybe finding those people to be sponsors and mentors, what are some ways for new attorneys to grow their network?
So I recently wrote a chapter of a book called Strategic Networking, Learning to Identify and Maximize Your Network. It's called something like that. I should know off the top of my head. And it really talks about systematizing networking, because I speak to lawyers every day who say, I'm looking for a new job, or I really am trying to generate clients and I can't do it and it's not happening. I'm going to these bar association events in the evening. Nothing's really happening. What do I do? And I start digging in terms of what they're doing. And what they're doing is often sort of superficial. And so what I recommend doing is actually starting with a spreadsheet and figuring out how to identify your network. So if you think of a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and you have different tabs on that, and you think of the law school question you asked, I would have tab 1 be all of my childhood friends and family friends, everybody I've known from my community growing up, everybody I knew through high school. And then my second tab is all of my college and law school contacts. And I would really encourage you to be broad on this. So maybe you went to college with somebody who you knew pretty well, and now she's married to this guy who does something of interest, but you don't really know him very well. He's on the list as well as her. And so you start with that. And by the way, for the practicing lawyers on the on the call, I would also add other tabs to that spreadsheet that I'll just mention, which is I'd put a third tab that's former colleagues and professional contacts, even if you've had at least one other job. The fourth tab could be current and post law school, your social network and your community. And the fifth tab may be your current colleagues and professional contacts. And so if you take that spreadsheet and list every conceivable person you can think of in each of those 5 categories, or again, if you're a law student, just those 2 categories, it ends up being a really long list of people. And then the next step is going to LinkedIn and seeing what all these people are doing, because LinkedIn is the easiest way to see who in your network are doing things of interest and who does it make sense to connect with, where are they geographically, etc. And so using then LinkedIn after you have updated your bio and make sure you like the way you look on LinkedIn, then starting to do very deliberate outreach through that and start figuring out who's doing things of interest, who does it make sense to talk to, and then write personal notes through LinkedIn of how to get in touch. So just, Katie, let's say you and I went to college together. I haven't been in touch with you in 5 years. You're doing really interesting work to me. I would just send, rather than just click on LinkedIn, the default of I want to join your professional network, I would write a personal note. Hi, Katie. It's been a long time since we've been in touch. Looks like you're doing really interesting things. Let me know if it's time for a catch-up call. Or if you're in my, town, love to grab lunch or coffee. And then you may not respond. You may respond just, hey, I've just got time for a call, whatever it is. But if you start doing that outreach on a daily basis to all of these people on all the tabs of your spreadsheet, and then start tracking what the success is, and then setting some goals. Like, I'd love to try to get 2 in-person meetings a week. I want to have 3 phone calls a week, depending on where you are geographically, what stage you're in. Maybe if you're a law student, you can't get away that way, whatever it may be. But really being deliberate about who in your network can make some introductions, who's doing things of interest, how can I get some informational calls going. And what's interesting is if you set those goals and have some targets each week that you're going to build on this process, it's cumulative. You have a really collective, powerful impact that starts going on and on. There's a lot more detail about how to do this on my website, and if you guys want to download these free articles from my website, you should at debbieepsteinhenry.com. There's a lot of advice about how to go through this process, but that's a little bit of a teaser.
And what about networking events? You know, I know a lot of young attorneys especially love to go to networking events, but sometimes, like you mentioned earlier, it's a very superficial kind of level. Are there things that can be done at networking events or ways to pick networking events so you know you're going to get something out of it?
Yes, absolutely. I think for starters, you want to make sure that the events that you're going to are ones of interest, where ideally you know how the networking event is going to run before you get there. So some are just, you know, kind of just you show up, there's a room, there's cocktails, and like people are just milling around for an hour. That's a very different thing than if there's some sort of breakout table discussions where you get to individually introduce yourself to certain people, or maybe there's a program and then there's a follow-up. So understanding actually what the format is of the venue where you're joining is a really important starting point. And then, you know, perhaps it's going with a friend or colleague to the event so that you're maximizing, you're increasing the number of people collectively that you may know together. So if you have people that you go with who you're not going to stay with all the time, but it may be just a starting point, can be really helpful. But I find that when I go to events, if I can know in advance, I look at the agenda, who's going to be there, if I can get access to the attendance list, or if I can see if I'm going to a program and there'll be a reception afterwards. I look, who are the speakers? Do I know these people? Do I want to know these people? I will do outreach in advance. Katie, I see you're speaking at this conference. I'm on a different panel. It would be great to grab coffee. Or I wanted to say a quick hello and look forward to meeting you in person, so that when I then meet you the next week, you're like, oh yeah, Debbie seems familiar to me. There's already something that we've built in together and that it's easier to follow up. So any of the homework that you can do in advance to, again, get the speakers or things like that can be really, really helpful. I think the other thing is, I think people make the mistake of thinking when they really are sort of delving into networking that they need to go to as many events as possible. I don't really think that. I think that if you can choose a few organizations, maybe 2 or 3, that are in your space, that are doing really interesting things, where you could hopefully become a leader in them, it's so much more impactful. First of all, if you're involved in something that's of interest to you, you feel like you're contributing, you're giving back. These are often nonprofit organizations that are desirous of people who have that energy to contribute. But then the networks that you build are so much more deepened than just kind of a superficial cocktail party. So that's also an important consideration, is kind of taking a step back, thinking about where can you align your own interests, where the professional opportunities are there as well, and then get more invested in those selective organizations and networking events that then arise.
You mentioned focusing on things that you're interested in, which kind of brings us to a question that was submitted that I think is a really good one. How do you talk to your supervisors, at your firm or at your company, and request, professional development money, or request to go to maybe an event to learn more about a certain topic without making it seem like you have concerns about capabilities or that you're not confident in your knowledge?
Absolutely. And I think, again, I'll come back to the recommendation that where can you align your own professional development with what will better the organization? Because if it's just about you, it's not really fair to ask the organization to support it. While you want your employer to have limitless funds, and even the best and most well-intentioned bosses want to support their people as much as they can, but there has to be a business case for it. So as a starting point, you want to see, again, how that new professional development training is going to better the organization, how that individual performance for you will enhance the organization. So saying, I know that there's some programming around executive presence, and that's an area that I'm really interested in developing, and I'm going to be presenting to the company board more, and that's something that's how a lot of people are evaluated, and it will help our legal department be that much more effective in terms of conveying our message to the board. Then it's saying, okay, well, this is a legitimate skill that our lawyer needs to cultivate in order to be more effective at judging, or delivering the recommendations on risk in these board meetings, let's say. So that's important. But the other thing is, I think that people really make the mistake when they are reviewed, let's say on an annual basis, that they don't really take ownership of the review process. And a lot of times they'll get reviews, even if the reviews are positive, and lawyers are loath to give bad reviews. They just kind of would rather be silent about it. But being that type of employee to say, oh, Katie, I really appreciate the generous feedback. I really am focused on being more successful and sort of continuing to grow at this company. If there are two things that you would recommend I would focus on in the next year to really elevate my game, what would it be? And you hear, well, one of it is going to be, let's say, you're going to, you need to sort of get out of your comfort zone and start presenting at meetings more and that kind of thing. Then again, you could justify, like, okay, I've asked my boss, he or she has said, that my next step to sort of elevate my game is to be able to present at meetings. I need more, skill in public speaking. So really linking up your own development with how you can improve, and any employer wants their, that's smart, wants their people to develop and contribute and elevate their game and all that. So again, trying to do that is really important. But also again, coming back to this theme of knowing your audience, some people care about professional development more than others. I know at Bliss Lawyers, the company that I co-own, I have two partners, and we're all different. We all care a lot about the business, but we have a team that reports to us, and some of us may care about something or another more than another. So if I were reporting to us, then I would think, okay, well, who really cares about this issue the most? Where is my most receptive audience here? And go to that person. So in this case, if you've got a boss you're reporting to, or two, and one, you're at a law firm and you're associate, and there are three partners you work most closely with, and one seems to really be more invested in your development, you go to that person because you feel like that's the most receptive audience that you have. The other thought is, coming back to this notion of sponsorship, maybe it's a more fitting ask for your sponsor. So maybe you've got some great senior partner at your firm who thinks you are the best, and maybe she or he can say, hey, if Katie really needs this extra training, I think we should send her to this one-day program for X, Y, and Z.
And you mentioned reviews a little bit, which is something that we haven't touched on, but I think feedback is really important when we talk about advocating for yourself and for your career. Some places I know have kind of defined review programs in place. If you don't feel like you're getting good feedback from that, or if maybe you're at a company that doesn't do an annual review, what are some ways you can still, push a little further and make sure you're getting the response and the critiques that you might need?
Right. I do think that the onus is more on the individual employee to get that real feedback, and I think it's really hard to accept feedback that's critical. I know, I'm sure some people on the line are podcast listeners, and I'll recommend a really great podcast on this. Adam Grant, who's a brilliant professor at Wharton, has his own podcast called Work Life, and one of my favorite episodes of his is called How to Love Criticism. And we have to get comfortable with that. And I think part of it is understanding that when you have a good boss, criticism means they care. It means that they want to invest in you and they want to develop you. And that's a gift if somebody is generous enough to care enough to give you that feedback and try to better you. If you don't have that boss, or maybe you just don't have that person who has those insights, you do want to be really thoughtful about asking other people in your organization how they got there, because maybe you won't get as much insight into your own performance, but maybe you'll be able to see, okay, I'm I'm an associate in the real estate group of this firm, and there are 3 partners in this group who are just particularly well received and doing particularly well here. What are they doing? Can I grab coffee with them and say, you know, I really admire you professionally, and I'd love to get some insights on what really has been pivotal for you and how you've been able to do this. Because success is not just your own performance, it's success within the organization that you work. So even if you're a law firm lawyer and you're a brilliant real estate lawyer, you being that person at one firm may not work as well with the culture at another firm. So part of it is getting feedback, not just about your performance, but really how you fit within the organization. I think the other thing is you have to be able to show that you are receptive to change. And so, you know, if you're a litigator and you get a brief back that's really a lot of red ink, to be able to not just get that brief, but then say to the partner, it was really instructive for me to read over your edits. If you have another 15, 30 minutes, I'd love to walk through with you your thought process to hopefully avoid some of those edits next time. So don't just take what's given to you, really, or maybe you get back a brief that's unrecognizable with the changes accepted and you can't even piece together what you actually originally submitted. You politely go to that partner and say, I see you really changed the brief, and I thought it was really strong how it ultimately came out. I'd love next time to get a red line of that so I can learn from this. And so show that real responsibility for your own career development.
I want to shift gears a little bit. We're getting closer to the end of our time. We've talked a lot about advocating for yourself in your workplace, with your supervisors, with your network. But a lot of attorneys on this call, are at law firms or maybe joining law firms soon, or even at in-house positions where they're very client-facing. So what are some ways that when you're speaking with clients and you're trying to, bring on new clients and work on your business development, that you can kind of do that self-promotion and get comfortable talking yourself up in that situation?
So my number one word when I talk about self-promotion is being a resource. I don't think it's about being, asking for favors or sort of being obnoxious about your self-promotion. I'm thinking, how can I help you? That's what self-promotion is about. It's about demonstrating your value and letting people know what you do and being informative about what you do so that one day you can help them. So for example, if I'm an employment lawyer and I meet you and we're at a cocktail party and I say, I'm with a great firm and we do employment work. We've had a lot of successes in the following areas. So I'm informative. I'm telling you, I am self-promoting. I'm telling you what I do. In self-promoting, I'm also telling you I had a great firm, but I'm actually being informative. And then 2 years later, you find yourself in a really bad employment situation, and you're really glad that you remembered me. Hopefully you liked me. And I was talking about myself and being a resource, but then ultimately I'm doing a favor for you. So it's a really different way to approach self-promotion, to think about being informative. And I want to give some other examples. I do a lot of speaking on self-promotion. I think it's a really awkward topic for a lot of people, particularly women. So I have some other examples I want to provide. I think the threshold issue on self-promotion is be great, because there's nothing worse than people talking about how good they are when they're not. And so you really want to be great. You also, along lines of being a resource, being a point person, I think a lot of self-promotion is just basically about visibility, that people see you and know you, and then through your visibility, you can help people, and that can also, of course, help you. But I think part of how I see particularly women self-promoting in a more effective way is when they can be factual. And let me give you an example through a resume, because I have a pet peeve of this. So sometimes people will send me resumes, and I'll see at the top of the resumes, there are all these bullets at the top of self-declared features about themselves. So it will say like team leader and great communicator and, whatever, all of these sort of platitudes about how fabulous they are. And I think this is ridiculous. It's not produced by some authority here. This is like a self-designated roles that people are saying about themselves. What I prefer is to see a resume that says, the first bullet says, led a team of 15 lawyers in the successful acquisition of this X billion-dollar company. And then I look at that, and I'm like, that's a good leader. That's somebody who delivers. And so to be factual, so when you are out there self-promoting, let's say I am that law firm lawyer trying to demonstrate to a prospective client that I can deliver, and they tell me they're in the IT space, I say, oh, that's great. Our IT team has been so busy, and we just handled the successful, trademark of such and such. And then I'm showing like, this is something I'm being resourceful on, and I'm being factual. I'm not bragging. I'm not saying like, we're the best. I'm saying, in fact, we just delivered this result. And then the client can say, oh, they must be the best. It's a different way to communicate information. But coming back to this whole theme around aligning your own self-promotion with that of your employer, I want to give you one of my favorite examples. I did an event years ago with a law firm partner where it was actually promoting my first book, and we did this event, and a lot of the law firm's clients were at the event. And the next day, she got tremendous accolades from various general counsel who were clients of the firm, and she forwarded one anonymously to me and said, I'm getting all these accolades from clients. I don't really know what to do because I want to forward these emails along to my managing partner who was at the event, but I don't want to be like, FYI, aren't I great? And I said, well, give me a little bit more context on one of these GCs. And she said, well, with one of them, she said, we've been handling this company's environmental litigation for years. They have a huge corporate business. They've never really let us into it, and it's an entree we've always wanted. And so I said, just forward the email from this GC and say, looks like Jim was really enthused about last night's event. Maybe now's the time to take him to lunch and pitch him on the bigger relationship and how we can start handling the corporate work. And that's exactly what she did, and that's exactly what happened. So to me, there's no better way to self-promote than to, in that case, align your own self-promotion, which was this GC saying, you did this fabulous event, with how do we use that to better the firm. So to me, that's a really, really effective thing. Just a couple other things real quick. One is what I call a promotion buddy. So let's say you have this wonderful colleague at your legal department who's doing great stuff, and they're looking for a new team member to jump in on doing some data security work. To be able to say, oh, Katie, it would be great for her. She should definitely join this team. She's doing such great things. And then, 2 months later, they are looking for somebody with my expertise. Katie, you're going to be more mindful. Like, can I bring Debbie into this? It's not some quid pro quo, but it is something that, if I'm worthy, you're going to be keeping me in mind as well. So that notion of having a promotion buddy, somebody you can be thoughtful about, they have to be good because you're putting your reputation and name behind them as well, can be really, really effective as well.
We've had a couple questions submitted in our chat, so I just want to go through a couple quickly. So the first one, someone on the call has heard the advice that you should be switching your career every 2 to 3 years. You're going to want to be moving to kind of make sure you're moving up the ladder and you're progressing. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a good plan? Are there other ways that you can make sure you're growing without maybe jumping companies? Kind of what's the perspective on that?
Yeah, I think our profession traditionally was really unforgiving and very linear. And I think over the past 20 years, it's become less so. That said, continuity is something that's still valued, and I don't think that jumping around every 2 years is the best way to advance or develop. or instill confidence in prospective employers. I think certainly that may be appropriate at times, but what continuity shows is loyalty, investment, patience, and the fact when I look at a resume and I see somebody, let's say, has been at a law firm for 5 years, I think, like, this person definitely delivered because, you know, that's a tough place to work and they stuck it out or that they advanced at different places. That said, I do not think happiness is a luxury. I think that we all perform better when we are happy and engaged in our work, and I don't think you should suffer through. And certainly, I don't mean this in any like sort of financial luxury way. We all have, you know, a lot of us have a lot of financial constraints, and that will dictate, of course, our jobs. But that all said, I think you want to balance the interest of jumping around with the importance of showing some continuity. I think also you want to be creative about opportunities for growth within your organization. So, you know, maybe at your law firm and you feel like there is really sort of a limit on what you can learn in this group already, but maybe it's time to get seconded to a client and have that experience. So you're still actually technically with a law firm, but you're getting this exciting opportunity to test out in-house work in another environment with other people. So there are ways to do that. And the other thing I see is that sometimes people who feel that the work environment is somewhat stagnant, that they feel like it's premature to leave, they start getting a lot more invested in work outside of their office. Maybe it's nonprofit work, maybe it's doing stuff through the bar association or something which is engaging them in a professional capacity, potentially, but it's kind of nurturing their soul if their work internally is not kind of inspiring them in the same way.
Another audience question we had that I think really ties into that is, you know, you're at a company, you love where you are, you love what you're doing, you're really not interested in maybe going somewhere else, but you feel like you've kind of plateaued a little bit. Maybe there's no, you know, open position that you can be promoted into. What are some ways that you can feel like you're still growing, feel like you're moving up and maybe getting some sort of promotion without having to leave?
Yeah, and I think this is tough. I think I see this with the in-house clients I work with in particular, that many legal departments are flat organizations. And so people, you know, sort of stuck with a title for years and years and feel like they're senior contributing attorneys and they're not quite recognized that way, although they are happy and they don't necessarily want to make a move. So some of the advice I'd give on that is similar to what I just said about, you know, this person who wants to potentially jump around every 2 years. Part of it may be getting fulfillment through committee work at the company, let's say, or through outside work, nonprofit work or bar association work, sort of fulfilling some of that development through other means within the company or outside of it. The other thing is I find increasingly lawyers and other professionals really want to develop as people, not just as lawyers. And so what I talk about, I talk about something called blueprinting for success. And it's about, well, the work is a sort of threshold issue that you want to be a talented lawyer, but what are these sort of extras in your life that you want to develop? And some of them is about developing as a leader, developing executive presence, or being more deliberate about developing sponsorship, relationships, and strategic alliances, or really developing your network more effectively, or showing how you're demonstrating your value and claiming your contribution at a workplace in a way that's well received by colleagues, or navigating the work-life challenges that we all have in a more effective way. So there's plenty of sort of personal development that you can do in your organizations to better yourself professionally. And if you have a little bit of a, you know, sort of a freedom to kind of explore yourself and develop yourself personally more, sometimes that can be something that's very rewarding in the long term.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. This was so helpful. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you have any other questions for Debbie, if we didn't get to your question, you know, please feel free to visit her website, DebbieEpsteinHenry.com. Reach out to her. I'm sure she would be happy to get to know you all and answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Katie. It was just wonderful. And congratulations on the work you're doing with Ms. JD and to Ms. JD as an organization as a whole. And to the listeners, thank you for your participation. And like Katie said, feel free to reach out, go to my website, and I hope to be a resource to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.